Hey everyone, and welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at another very helpful extension of pivot tables, and these are pivot charts. Pivot charts complement pivot tables by enabling us to visualize the summarized data within them, allowing us to identify trends more effectively. One of the other good parts about pivot charts is that they're very easy to create and modify as they're linked to our pivot tables, so you can just drag and drop the data that we want to visualize. With that said, let's get started. Like last time, we'll start from the raw dataset, which again will be our movies dataset that we've already looked at. To create a pivot chart, we can either use an existing pivot table or just go directly to creating a pivot chart from our data. And like with creating our pivot tables, we need to make sure that our data is prepped. So this includes it being in a tabular format, having descriptive column headings, no missing rows or columns in our data, and then when we're happy with our data, the last optional step was to format it as a table. And now we're ready to create our pivot chart. Let's select any cell that's inside of our dataset, and then we can head on up to the Insert tab. In our Charts group, we have an option for Pivot Chart, and Microsoft describes this as a way to graphically summarize and explore complicated data. So let's go ahead and click on this, and that will open up the Create Pivot Chart wizard. The first bit of information that we need to provide is the table range, which Excel has automatically identified as being table 1, which is correct. Next, we'll need to specify where we want our pivot chart to be placed, and like pivot tables, we can either select a new worksheet or place it into an existing worksheet. I'll just leave it as a new worksheet, and then we can go ahead and click on OK. This will then place us into a new worksheet, and on the left, we can see our blank pivot table, which we're already familiar with. But then on the right here, we have our empty pivot chart. And this currently doesn't look like a chart. As we start adding data to our fields, it'll update. Off to the far right hand side of our workbook, we have the pivot chart fields pane. And this is instead of the pivot table fields pane that we've had previously when we've had our pivot table selected, as we can see here. So just like before, we get our fields up here in this list. And then below that, we have 4 different boxes, with the axis and legend boxes replacing the rows and columns boxes from our previous pivot table fields pane. Let's now use these 4 areas to begin putting our chart together. For our first pivot chart, we'll use one of the examples that we've looked at previously, and that's the average score for our films by year. And that means we'll have our categories in the year. Before we create this though, I just want to mention that Excel will use your default chart type that we set in the last section of this course. If you followed along, your pivot chart will probably be a line chart. So if you need to, you can go back to your All Charts menu and change it to a column chart so that you can follow along with me as we go through this lecture. If we look here, the bottom left box in our fields pane is the axis or categories box. So let's take our year and drag it down into this area. And on the left-hand side of our worksheet, we'll see that our pivot table has also updated. And this is because our pivot charts and pivot tables are linked. So if we select our pivot table, we'll see that we also have the year inside of our rows area. So any changes made in one pane will be reflected in the other pane too. Next, I would also like to include our average score for each year too. And like last time, we can go ahead and drag this field into our values area. And of course, we'll need to change this to our average, and we can make this change from within our value field settings. And there we go. We now have the average score for all of our films in our IMDb movies dataset, now visualized on our pivot chart. And this here is a good example to illustrate what I mentioned earlier, that it's not a good idea to include too many different categories in a column chart, as it becomes very cluttered and hard to look at what's going on, as we can see here. Let's try replacing our year category with the genre instead. And even this is quite busy, so you probably wouldn't want many more categories in this, but it does already look much better. And it'll be very easy now to change this chart to show the average of our gross revenue for each genre instead. All we need to do is remove our average score value and then add in the average of our gross column. And just as quick as that, we can change our entire chart. Let's also say that we want to see the average of the budget for each genre too. so that we can see if any genres tend to be more profitable than others. To do this, we can take our budget field and drag this down into our values area too. And then we'll change this to be the average. And now we have our gross revenue in blue and then our budget column in orange. And now we can easily see that the animation and family films tend to be the most profitable. And off to the right here, we can see romance and western films look to barely break even in most cases. Again, to remove our average budget is super easy. All we need to do is click and drag it out of the area. And that's how easy it is to create and modify our pivot charts. We'll now have a look at something that pivot charts can do that regular charts can't. Let's have a look at how the average budget for our genres vary by the age rating of the film. We can drag our rating field down into our axis area here. Our chart will show all of our ratings at the top level and then our genres below. If we wanted our genres at the top level, we could just swap these two fields around. Obviously, this chart here doesn't look too good as there's way too much information on display, but this really is just to show and demonstrate how pivot charts work and how to create them. We'll look at creating some better examples in the next section, where I'll place more emphasis on their appearance and ease of reading. Like with regular charts, we can also change the type of our pivot chart. If we right click on our chart, we get the option to change the chart type. If we go ahead and open this up, we'll get the same change chart type menu that we got before. Something to note here is that these bottom 7 charts, so from the tree map right down to the combo charts, are not available to use with pivot charts. Let's try converting our column chart here into a pie chart. So we'll go ahead and select that and click OK. And here is our updated pivot table, but this time using a pie chart. Again, this is a far from ideal chart due to the large number of categories that we have, as well as the fact that these slices here are way too small and it's hard to pick out what category these represent. So in a real world project, we'd likely carry out some data cleaning to group together some of these smaller categories. But as mentioned, this really is just to show you how to create these charts on a familiar dataset. Like with our regular charts, we can also apply formatting and styling to our pivot charts as well. I won't go into too much detail with these, as they're pretty much all the same as they were for our regular chart options, but we will have a quick look through the Design tab. With our chart selected, we can navigate to our Design tab up here at the top, and then we've got these same options. So to start with, we can add in some chart elements, adjust the quick layout options. So I'll just select the first one here to add in some data labels, the colors used by the chart, and then in the middle we have some pre-made styles. And I quite like the grey one, which is style 7, so I'll go ahead and select that. And then off to the right, we have our same 4 buttons that we looked at in the last section. So the switch, row and column, select data, change chart type, and move chart. To finish off this lecture, let's have a look at how we can filter the data that is shown on our pivot chart. And let's say that we want to look at films only from certain countries. So we'll say Germany, Spain, and the UK. If we go to our country column up here in our fields list, we can click on this little drop down arrow here off to the right, and in this menu we can select what countries we want. So I'll just deselect everything and then select our 3 countries, which were Germany, Spain, and the United Kingdom. If we click OK on this, we'll see that our chart hasn't updated, and this is because this field isn't actually in any of our areas. If we drag this into our filters area, we'll see that the chart updates as well as the data in our pivot table, and now we only see the data for our selected countries. Okay, and this wraps it up now for our section on pivot tables and pivot charts. I hope you found this section to be valuable. Pivot tables are one of the best and quickest ways to explore your data and to unpick some of the data present. In the next section, we'll take what we've learned so far and then apply that knowledge to a real-world data set. So we'll start from the beginning of the process by cleaning our data. We'll then take some of the tools, functions, and formulas that we've learned about so far, including pivot tables, to analyze this data and then visualize our results with some of the chart options we've explored so far. So I hope you're excited for this, and I'll see you in the next section where we can begin work on our first portfolio project.